The nursery smelled of milk and lavender water, and of the soft wool blanket that had been folded across the foot of the small carved cradle. Miss Vivienne Ashcombe stood by the window with a letter in her hand, and she was trying to read it for the third time, and for the third time she could not make her eyes hold still on the words. The paper shook in her fingers, though she had told herself an hour ago that it would not shake. Outside, the July sun lay across the gardens of Ravenholm in a heavy gold sheet, and somewhere below a groom was whistling a tune she did not know. Inside, the child slept, and the room was warm, and the tall windows had been opened a hand's breadth to let in the smell of cut grass and roses and the faint bitter note of the box hedge that ran along the south wall. She lowered the letter. She looked at the cradle. The baby, who was called Anselm and who was 6 months old, and who was the son and only heir of the Duke of Ravenholm, lay on his back with one small fist pressed against his cheek. His mouth was open a little. His hair, which was as pale as barley, was damp at the temples. He had been fed an hour ago by the wet nurse, Mrs. Poole, who was now downstairs eating her dinner, and he would sleep, if the day held its usual shape, for another 40 minutes. Vivienne folded the letter in half. She folded it again. Then she pressed it flat against the top of the low chest of drawers by the window, and she smoothed it with the side of her hand, as though smoothing it could smooth also the thing inside her that had begun to shake when she had read the first line. The letter was from her sister. Her sister was called Marin, and her sister had been married for 2 years to a man in Bath. And her sister had not written for 11 months, and now her sister had written. "My dear Vivienne," the letter said, "I must ask you to come. I have been ill in a way I cannot put in a letter. I have no one else. Please, if there is any love left in you for me, come." Vivienne pressed her palm against the folded page. She looked again at the cradle. She thought, "I cannot go." She thought, "I have been here only 3 months." She thought, "The Duke will not release me." She thought, "And Marin has not written for 11 months." She thought, "And I do not know what she has done or what has been done to her, and I do not know the man she married, and there was a reason I did not know him, and that reason was that she chose him against every warning I gave her, and now she has written to me, because I am the only one left." The baby made a small sound in his sleep. She turned her head. She had come to Ravenholm in the 2nd week of April, when the daffodils were just going brown along the gravel paths, and she had come because her father had died in November, owing money to 3 separate men in 3 separate counties, and she had come because there had been nothing else to be done. Her mother's cousin had known the housekeeper of the Duke of Ravenholm, and the Duke of Ravenholm's wife had died in childbed 6 months before. And the Duke of Ravenholm was in need of a woman of good breeding and quiet manners to sit with his son for the hours of the day when the wet nurse was not needed and the head nurse was busy with the running of the nursery below. It was not a governess's post. It was not quite a lady's post either. It was a strange, small, half-visible position, and it paid £29 a year, and it came with a room above the nursery, with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over the west lawn, and it was the only thing she had, and she had taken it. She had not expected to love the child. She had told herself, on the drive up the long avenue of limes, that she would be careful, that she would do her duty, and that she would not allow her heart to fix itself on a thing that could be taken from her at any hour. She had told herself this very firmly. And then she had walked into the nursery on that first afternoon, and the baby had been crying in the arms of a young maid who did not know how to hold him. And Vivienne had crossed the room without thinking and taken him and turned him so that his cheek lay against the hollow of her shoulder. And he had stopped crying, just like that. And she had felt something break open in her chest that she had spent a great many years keeping closed. Now she stood by the window, and she thought of Marin, and she thought of the child, and she did not know what she was going to do. There was a sound in the corridor. She turned her head. The sound was the sound of a boot on the polished oak, and it was heavy, and it was slow, and she knew the sound before she had time to name it. She stepped back from the window. She placed the folded letter inside the small workbasket on the chest of drawers, and she covered it with a length of white cambric, and she smoothed her apron with both hands, and she turned to face the door. The Duke of Ravenholm came in without knocking, because it was his house and his nursery and his son, and he came in as he always came in, which was to say quietly, and without looking directly at any person in the room for the first several seconds. He was a tall man. He was not classically handsome. He had a broad forehead and a nose that had been broken once at school and never quite mended straight, and his eyes were a color that Vivienne had not yet been able to fix in her mind, because they seemed gray in some lights and green in others, and once, in the long dusk of a June evening, they had looked almost gold. His name was Alistair Renford, and he was 31 years old, and he had been a widower for 9 months, and he had a way of standing in a room that made every other person in the room stand a little straighter without meaning to. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Your Grace," she said. He crossed to the cradle. He looked down at the child. He did not touch the child. He never touched the child when he came in, though Vivienne had learned in 3 months that he came in 3 or 4 times a day, and that he stood at the cradle for some minutes each time, and that when he thought no one was looking, he sometimes rested the tip of one finger very lightly on the edge of the blanket, as though checking that the blanket was still there. "He sleeps," Alistair said. "Yes, Your Grace. He was well this morning?" "He was very well, Your Grace. He took his feed at 10. He was awake for perhaps an hour after." He watched the birds at the window. Alistair nodded. He did not smile. He had not smiled once that Vivienne had seen in the whole 3 months of her employment. He turned from the cradle. He looked at her, and his gaze went from her face to the workbasket on the chest of drawers, and then back to her face, and she felt her cheeks heat, though she had done nothing to be ashamed of. "You have had a letter," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." "Bad news?" She had not expected the question. She had expected him to walk out again as he always did. She stood for a moment with her mouth slightly open, and then she closed it, and she folded her hands in front of her apron, and she said, "My sister is unwell. She writes from Bath." He watched her. He did not ask another question. He waited. She had noticed in the 3 months that he was a man who used silence the way other men use speech. "I do not know yet," she said, "whether I must go to her." He nodded again. He turned toward the door. Then he stopped, and he turned back and he said, "If you must go, you will go. The child will do without you for a fortnight. Mrs. Poole is competent. The head nurse is competent. You will not lose your place." She could not speak for a moment. She stared at him. She had expected many things, and she had not expected this. He was not a man who gave gifts of that kind. He had not, in the 3 months, given her a single word that was not strictly required by the day's business. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, when she could speak. He inclined his head. He went out. His boot on the oak grew fainter down the corridor. And then it was gone, and the room was very quiet, and Vivienne stood by the window, and she did not know why her eyes had filled. She was not a woman who wept easily. She had not wept when her father died, nor when the men had come to take the furniture from her mother's parlor, nor when her mother had gone to live with a cousin in Somerset and had told her, in a small dry voice at the coach, that she must make her own way now. She had not wept then. She did not weep now. But she stood by the window for a long moment, and she pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth, and she breathed slowly through her nose until the thing in her chest lay flat again. Then she went to the cradle. She looked at the child. She thought, "I do not want to leave you." She thought, "Not even for a fortnight." She thought, "I did not know I could feel this for a thing that is not mine." She sat down in the low chair beside the cradle, and she took up her mending, and she waited for the baby to wake. It was 3 days later that she saw the viper. The nursery at Ravenholm was on the 2nd floor of the east wing. and the tall windows opened out onto a stone balcony that ran the length of that side of the house, and below the balcony there was a low garden of lavender and rosemary and a great many box shrubs that had been trimmed into round green shapes. The balcony was old. It had been laid in the time of the last Duke's grandfather, and the stones were worn smooth in the middle where the maids walked to shake out the linen, and there were small cracks between some of the stones where moss had grown and been pulled and grown again. It was a hot day, the hottest so far that summer. The wet nurse had gone down to her dinner. The head nurse, Mrs. Thorne, was in the linen room on the floor below, folding the small clothes that had come up dry from the laundry. Vivienne was alone in the nursery with the child, who was awake but drowsy, lying on a folded quilt on the rug in a shaft of sun. She had opened the balcony door, and the door stood half open, and the smell of the lavender came in on a thin, warm wind, and she had thought that in a few minutes she would take the child up in her arms and walk him a little on the balcony because he liked to watch the swallows dip along the eaves. She did not know, afterwards, what had made her look. There had been no sound. There had been no shadow. Later, when she tried to tell herself the shape of the moment, she could remember only that she had been sitting on the low chair with her mending in her lap, and that she had looked up, and that her eye had caught, in the strip of sun between the door and the rug, a thing that was not a thing that belonged in a nursery. It was long. It was thicker than her thumb at the middle. It was the color of old brass and dark leaves, with a pattern along its back like the shadow of small V's set one behind the other. Its head was flat and a little wider than its neck, and its neck moved, and its tongue came out, and its tongue was black and forked, and it was 3 feet from the child. Vivienne did not scream. She did not know why she did not scream. Later she would think about this, and she would understand that she had not screamed because screaming would have taken breath, and breath would have taken time, and time was the one thing she did not have. She stood up. Her mending fell off her knees onto the floor. She did not look at it. She looked at the viper. The viper looked at nothing. The viper had begun to move again, and it was moving in the slow, easy way of a thing that had all afternoon and no particular fear, and it was moving toward the child. She thought, very clearly, 3 things at once. She thought, if I run for the door, I will bring Mrs. Thorne, but the child will be bitten before I return. She thought, if I shout, the child will wake, and if the child wakes, the child will thrash, and the viper is close enough to strike. She thought, there is no other person in this room, and there is no other thing to do, and this is the moment now, and it will not come again. She stepped forward. She stepped over the mending. She stepped, with a strange, careful lightness, between the viper and the child, so that if the viper struck it would strike her boot or her skirt and not the baby's arm. She lowered herself to a crouch. The viper's head turned. Its tongue came out again. It was not, she noticed with a distant, floating part of her mind, particularly afraid of her. That was worse. A frightened animal moved quickly. A calm one waited. She did not think about what she was doing. If she had thought about it, she would not have been able to do it. She reached with her left hand for the small brass fire tongs that stood in the grate against the far wall, but the grate was too far, and the viper was moving again, and if she rose to go to it, the child would be alone. She swallowed. She unfolded her apron. She lifted her right hand. She caught it behind the head. She caught it with her bare hand. She caught it exactly where she had once, as a girl of 10, watched a stableman on her uncle's farm catch an adder that had come into the hay barn. She had been 10 years old, and she had stood at the edge of the barn door, and she had watched him do it, and the stableman had said afterwards, when her uncle scolded him for showing such a thing to a child, "It's not the strength, sir, it's the place. You get it just behind the jaw and it can't turn its head." She had remembered. 21 years, and she had remembered. Her fingers closed around a thing that was cool and dry and very strong, and the tail whipped up against her wrist, and the tail whipped again against her forearm, and she held on. She rose slowly to her feet. Her hand was shaking, but her fingers were not shaking. The child, on the rug, made a small soft sound and did not wake. She walked very slowly to the balcony door. She walked out onto the stones. The sun was hot on the top of her head. The lavender smelled thicker out here, and there was a bee somewhere close, and she could hear the swallows crying. She walked to the far end of the balcony where the stone rail went down in a shallow curve to meet the low roof of the kitchen wing. She leaned out. Below the roof there was a stretch of long grass that ran down to the edge of the deer park, and beyond that the trees began, and there was no path there, and no person there, and it was as far from the nursery as she could send anything from where she stood. She threw the viper. She threw it with the flat, controlled motion of a woman who had once, as a girl, thrown apples for the pigs on her uncle's farm. The viper flew. It struck the long grass. It vanished. She stood on the balcony, with her right hand held out from her body, the fingers still curled as though they still held something, and she looked at her hand, and she saw that the skin of her palm was not broken. She looked at her wrist, and the skin there was not broken either. She turned her hand over. She looked at the back of her hand. There was a small red mark along the outside of her wrist where the tail had struck. That was all. She began to shake then. Her knees went, and she sat down on the warm stone of the balcony, and she put her hands flat on the stone on either side of her, and she breathed. The stone was warm. The bee was still somewhere close. Inside the nursery, the child, who did not know, gave a small, sleepy sound and settled again on his rug. She did not know how long she sat there. It might have been 3 minutes. It might have been 10. When she stood, her legs felt as though they belonged to another woman, and she walked back into the nursery on those borrowed legs, and she closed the balcony door behind her, and she turned the small brass key in the lock, and she leaned her forehead against the glass for one long moment, and then she straightened. She went to the child. She knelt on the rug. She picked him up. She held him against her shoulder, and she pressed her face into the pale barley hair at the crown of his head, and she breathed in the smell of milk and clean linen, and the small, warm animal smell of him, and she held him for a very long time. She was still holding him when the door opened and the Duke of Ravenholm walked in. He stopped, just inside the door. He looked at her. He looked at the empty rug where the child had been. He looked at her again. She saw his eyes take in her face, which she could feel was very pale, and her hands, which were still shaking a little where she held the child, and the balcony door, which was closed, and the small overturned workbasket by the low chair, though she did not remember overturning it. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Your Grace," she said. She did not trust her voice. She heard the small, unsteady sound of it, and she did not like it. What has happened? It was not a question. She looked at him for a moment. She thought of 10 different ways to tell him, and none of them would come out of her mouth in the right shape. She swallowed. "There was a viper," she said. He did not speak. His face did not change, exactly, but something went out of it, and something else came into it, and she could not have named either. "In the nursery?" he said. "On the rug, between me and the child. I do not know how it came in. I had opened the balcony door for the air. Where is it now? I threw it from the balcony, into the long grass at the west of the kitchen wing." He looked at her hand where it lay against the child's back. He looked at her other hand. "You were bitten." "No, Your Grace." "Show me." She hesitated. She shifted the child in her arms so that his weight rested against her left shoulder, and she held out her right hand, palm up, and then turned it. He crossed the room. He took her wrist. He was very careful. He looked at the small red mark on the outside of her wrist where the tail had struck, and he looked at her fingers, and he turned her hand over again, and he did not let go for a moment longer than he needed to. "That is the tail," he said. "Yes, you caught it behind the head." Yes, he let go of her wrist. He looked at her. His eyes were the gray that they were sometimes, and they were not gray now in the same way. They were gray and very still, and he did not move for a long moment. "You caught it with your bare hands. There was nothing else. There is a poker in the grate. The grate was too far. The child was on the rug." He looked at the rug. He looked at the child. He looked at the balcony door. He was working it out in his mind, she could see, the geometry of the thing, where the viper had been and where she had been and where the child had been, and how many seconds she had had, and what would have happened if she had gone for the poker. "Sit down," he said. "I am well, Your Grace. Sit down, Miss Ashcombe." She sat. She sat on the low chair, and she kept the child against her shoulder because she did not want to put him back on the rug just yet, and because holding him was the thing that was keeping her hands from beginning to shake in earnest. He crossed to the bell pull. He rang it. He rang it once, sharply, and then he came back to the middle of the room, and he stood there, and he did not speak until Mrs. Thorne came running up the stairs and appeared at the door, with a face already white because of the sharpness of the bell. "Your Grace?" "Send for Barton," he said. "There is a viper in the long grass by the kitchen wing. I want it found and killed. Send 2 men. Tell them to be careful. Then send Mrs. Poole to sit with the child. Miss Ashcombe will be leaving the nursery for the afternoon." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Thorne's eyes went to Vivienne and to the child, and she made a small sound that was not quite a word, and she went. Alistair turned back to Vivienne. "You will come to my study when Mrs. Poole is here." "Your Grace, I am quite well. You will come to my study, Miss Ashcombe." She swallowed. "Yes, Your Grace." He went out. Mrs. Poole came within 3 minutes. She came in with her cap askew and her apron only half tied, and when she saw Vivienne still holding the child, she said, "Oh, miss," in a small breaking voice, and Vivienne stood up and gave her the baby, and Mrs. Poole held him very tight and did not say anything more for a moment. "He is not hurt," Vivienne said. "He did not even wake." "Bless him," said Mrs. Poole. "Bless him." "And bless you, miss." Vivienne smoothed her apron. She looked once more at the child. She did not touch him. She went out of the nursery, and she went down the corridor, and she went down the wide oak stairs, and she went to the Duke's study, and she knocked. "Come." She went in. She had never been in his study before. It was a long room with tall windows on the south side, and the walls were dark green, and there were books to the ceiling on 2 walls, and there was a great desk in the middle of the room with papers on it, and behind the desk there was a fireplace, and the fireplace was empty because of the season. There were 2 chairs on the near side of the desk. He was standing by the window with his back to her. "Sit," he said, without turning. She sat. He turned. He crossed to the desk. He did not sit. He rested the tips of his fingers on the edge of the desk, and he looked at her, and he said, "How did you know?" "Your Grace, how did you know how to catch it? Not every woman would. Not every man would." She looked at her hands, which she had folded in her lap. She said, "I saw it done once, when I was a child, on my uncle's farm, an adder in the hay barn. The stableman caught it behind the head. He said afterwards it was the place, not the strength. I remembered. When you were a child, I was 10. You are how old now?" 31, Your Grace." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did sit. He sat behind the desk. He did not lean back. He leaned forward. He put his elbows on the desk, and he laced his fingers, and he looked at her over the laced fingers, and he said, "Miss Ashcombe, I owe you the life of my son. Your Grace, please, I will speak, if you will let me. I have not been generous, since I engaged you, with the words that ought to have been said. I have not always been generous with words at any time. I will not pretend to be a man I am not. But this is a thing that must be said, and I will say it. You saved him. I will not forget it. This house will not forget it. She looked at her hands. She could not look at his face. She said, it was what any person would have done. That is not true, he said. You know it is not true. Do not do me the discourtesy of pretending it is. She looked up. His eyes were on her, and they were not gray now. They were the color they had been in the June dusk, gold and a little grave, and she could not, for a moment, look away. Your Grace, she said. She meant to say more. She could not think what more. He unfolded his hands. He opened a drawer of the desk. He took out a small folded paper. He said, Your sister. In Bath, yes, Your Grace. You will go to her. You will go tomorrow. My carriage will take you. You will stay for as long as she has need of you. Your wages will continue. Your place will be kept. And you will take with you a letter to a physician I know in Bath. He is called Dr. Fenwick. He will attend your sister at my expense until she is well, or he has done all a physician can. That is not a matter of debate. She stared at him. She opened her mouth. She closed it. I cannot, she began. You can, he said. You will. Do not turn a small kindness into a larger question than it needs to be. It is not a small kindness. It is very small, he said, against the life of my son. She swallowed. Her eyes stung, and she did not want them to sting, and she pressed her hands together in her lap, and she said, Thank you, Your Grace. He inclined his head. He looked away from her then, and out at the window, as though he had said more than he had planned to say, and needed a moment. She saw the line of his jaw and the small scar at his temple which she had never before seen up close, and she thought, He is not a young man, and he is not an old man, and I do not know how I did not notice before that he is kind. Miss Ashcombe, he said, still looking at the window, one more thing. Your Grace, how is it exactly that a viper came into the nursery of Ravenholm? She said, I do not know. No, he said, nor do I. But I intend to find out. She went to Bath. The carriage came for her at 9:30 in the morning, and Mrs. Thorne saw her off at the servant's door with a small package of bread and cheese and a face full of feeling that Mrs. Thorne had not yet found words for, and the coachman handed her up and the horses moved off. And Vivienne looked back once at the tall gray house of Ravenholm with its many chimneys and its long windows, and she thought, I will be back in a fortnight. She did not know then that she would be gone for 3 weeks. She did not know that a great many things would have happened in 3 weeks. The road to Bath was long and hot and dusty, and she reached the house of her sister on the second day at 4 p.m, and she found her sister in a small back bedroom above a shop, with a broken lip and a bruise the shape of a hand along her jaw and a fever from a wound in her side that had not been dressed. Vivienne stood in the doorway for the space of one breath, and then she went to her sister, and she took her sister's hand, and she did not speak. Because there were no words that would do anything, and it was the deeds that were needed now, not words. The physician came within the hour. His name was Dr. Fenwick, and he was a small, tidy, sharp-eyed man with a Scottish way of speaking, and he examined Marin, and he cleaned the wound in her side, and he set the bones in her left hand, which had been broken 3 weeks before, and had not been set, and he said, when he came out into the little parlor where Vivienne was waiting, Miss Ashcombe, your sister has been beaten by her husband. You know this. I guessed it, Vivienne said. The wound in her side is a knife wound. It is not new. It should have killed her a week ago. It did not, because your sister is a stubborn woman. Where is the husband? He is gone. The neighbors say he went 2 nights ago and has not come back. He owes money in this street. He will not come back. Will she live? Yes, said Dr. Fenwick. She will live. She will not be quick to be well, but she will be well. His Grace has instructed me to attend her without limit. I shall do so. You are to remain with her until I release you. Those were the instructions I received, and I am a Scotchman, Miss Ashcombe, and I do not disregard instructions." She almost laughed. She had not thought she would laugh that day, and she almost did. She thanked him instead. She thanked him twice. She stayed 3 weeks. She sat with Marin in the small back bedroom, and she read to her, and she fed her broth, and she wrote letters for her, and she watched the bruise on her sister's jaw fade from the color of a plum to the color of old tea to nothing at all. She watched the wound in her sister's side close. She watched her sister sleep without waking in fear. On the 2nd week, Marin said one evening, "Vivienne, why did he do this? The Duke. Why did he send you? Why did he send the doctor? You did not tell me." Vivienne was folding a shawl. She did not look up. She said, "I did him a small service. He is repaying it. A small service. Yes, you are a poor liar, my dear. You always were." Vivienne smiled then for the first time in some days. She said, "I caught a viper in his nursery. It was going toward his son. I caught it with my hands." Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Vivienne, yes, you are going to marry that man. Do not talk foolishness. He is a duke. I am a paid attendant in his nursery. You are going to marry him," said Marin. She lay back on her pillow, and she smiled the small, thin, tired smile of a woman who had once, before all this, been the prettiest girl in 3 parishes. "I have said it. I am ill, and I have said it. It is prophecy. Go to sleep, Marin. I am going to sleep. But I have said it." Vivienne, when she left the room a little later, stood in the small dark passageway outside her sister's door, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, and she did not know why she was smiling. At the end of the 3rd week, Dr. Fenwick released her, and Marin was well enough to sit up in a chair by the window and take her tea without help. And Vivienne kissed her sister on the forehead and said she would write, and she took the carriage that the Duke had sent again, and she went back to Ravenholm. She arrived on a Wednesday at 7 in the evening in a soft rain. The gravel was dark and shining under the wheels. The lamps had been lit at the great door. She was tired to her bones. She had thought, on the road, that she would go quietly to her room above the nursery, and that she would see the child in the morning, and that she would not need to speak to anyone that night. But when the carriage stopped, the door of the house opened, and the Duke himself came down the steps. He was not wearing a coat. He had come out just as he was, in his shirt-sleeves and his waistcoat, and the rain was falling on him, and he did not seem to notice. He opened the carriage door before the footman could reach it. He held out his hand to her. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She took his hand and she stepped down onto the gravel. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. "Your Grace, your sister is well?" "She is well." "Dr. Fenwick has been very kind." "Good." He did not let go of her hand for a moment. Then he did. He said, "You must be tired. There is a supper waiting for you in the small parlor. When you have eaten, I would speak with you. If you can bear it." "I can bear it, Your Grace." Good, she ate. She had not thought she would be able to eat, but she found she was very hungry, and the small parlor was warm, and there was a fire in the grate though it was July, because of the rain and the cool of the evening, and there was cold chicken and bread and a small dish of stewed apples, and she ate almost all of it, and the maid who waited on her, who was called Susan, poured her a glass of wine and said, "It's good to have you back, miss," in a low voice, as though the saying of it were a thing that had to be smuggled in. When she was done, the maid took her to the Duke's study. He was standing by the fireplace. There was a fire in this room, too. The green walls looked deeper in the firelight, almost the color of moss. He turned when she came in. He waited until the door had closed behind her. "Sit," he said. She sat. He did not sit. He said, "I told you, when you left, that I would find out how the viper came into the nursery. I have found out." She looked up at him. She waited. It did not come in by the balcony. Vipers do not climb stone walls of that height. They cannot. It was brought. "Brought," she said. Brought, he said, into the nursery, in a basket, by a woman who had been employed as an undermaid for 6 weeks. Her name was Prudence Miller. She was paid 2 guineas for the doing of it. She has been arrested and is in the County Gaol. She has named the person who paid her. Vivienne did not speak. The person who paid her, said Alastair, is my cousin. My cousin is called Roderick Renford. He is the son of my father's younger brother. If my son were to die, and if I were to die without another heir, Roderick would inherit Ravenholm and the title and the whole estate. She stared at him. He has been in some difficulty for money, said Alastair. His voice was level. He was speaking as a man who had thought a great deal about a thing and who had come out on the other side of the thinking and who was now only reporting. He has been in some difficulty for some years. My wife's death and my son's birth changed the arithmetic of his inheritance considerably. My son is very small. A great many things can happen to a very small child. I did not, when I looked at the matter after your sister's letter first came, believe my cousin capable of this. I do now. What will happen to him? He will be tried. He will be convicted. He will hang, or he will be transported, according to the mercy of the court. I am not inclined to spend the influence of my house to soften the outcome. I have said as much to my aunt. She has taken it ill. I am sorry, Your Grace. He looked at her. You are sorry. I am. It is a hard thing to lose family in such a way. Miss Ashcombe, he tried to have my son killed, I know, and still I am sorry. For you. He looked away then. He looked at the fire. He was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was lower, and it was slower, and it was the voice of a man speaking to himself as much as to her. You saved my son, he said. You saved my son with your bare hands, and you asked for nothing. You went to your sister and you nursed her, and you did not once, in 3 weeks, write to remind me of what I owed you. You came back. You came back tonight, and you sat in that parlor, and you ate cold chicken as though nothing had happened. And now I have told you that my own blood tried to have my son killed, and the first thing you say to me is that you are sorry for me. He turned. He looked at her. His eyes were the gold color she had seen once before. I do not know, he said, what I have done to deserve you in my house. She could not speak. She sat very still. She could hear the fire and the rain against the tall windows, and, somewhere far below in the servants' hall, someone laughing. Your Grace, she said, when she could speak. Yes, I am a paid attendant in your nursery. I have been in your house for 4 months. You do not know me. I know you, he said. I have watched you for 4 months. I know you. Your Grace, wait, he said. Do not answer me tonight. I am not asking you to answer me tonight. I am telling you what is true, and I am telling you because I do not want you to sit in that room above the nursery tomorrow morning and wonder whether you dreamt what I said. You did not dream it. I have watched you for 4 months, Miss Ashcombe. I watched you the first day, when the child cried in the arms of a maid who did not know how to hold him, and you crossed the room without being asked and took him. I watched you the second week, when Mrs. Thorne fell down the back stair and broke her wrist, and you went down to the kitchen at 11 at night and made her a poultice yourself because you did not want to wake the cook. I watched you the day you found the small kitchen boy crying in the corridor because he had broken a plate, and you took the plate from him and said you had broken it yourself, and you paid the cook for it out of your own wages when I would have paid 10 times the cost. Do you think I did not know? I knew. I know. She had not known he knew. About the plate. About Mrs. Thorne she had not known. Your Grace, I have not finished, he said. I said I would not ask you to answer me tonight, and I mean it. But I will say this. You will not go back to the nursery tomorrow morning as a paid attendant. You will not go back to it at all in that capacity. I do not want your service in that room any longer. I want something else of you, and I will ask you for it when you are ready to be asked. Until then you will stay in this house as my guest, and Mrs. Poole and Mrs. Thorne will manage the child between them as they did when you were in Bath. Do you understand me?" "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was very small. "Your Grace, this is not. You cannot, I can," he said. "It is my house." She stared at him. He looked back at her. Then, quite suddenly, the corner of his mouth moved, just a little, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the first movement of that kind she had ever seen on his face, and it undid her more than any of the words had done. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "go to bed. You have had a long day." She went. She did not remember, afterwards, walking up the stairs. She remembered only that she reached her small room above the nursery, and she sat down on the edge of her narrow bed, and she looked at her hands, and she thought, "I caught a viper with these hands, and I did not know what I was catching, and I still do not." She did not go back to the nursery the next morning. She went, instead, at 10 o'clock when Mrs. Poole was there, and she asked if she might sit with the child a little, and Mrs. Poole said, "Miss, this is your room as much as any," and Vivienne sat by the cradle, and she held the child on her knee, and she looked at his pale barley hair and his open watching eyes, and she thought, "You do not know. You will never know." And that is right. She stayed in the house. She was moved, that same day, from her small room above the nursery to a proper bedroom on the second floor of the south wing, with a window that looked out over the rose garden and a small dressing room and a maid to attend her. She protested. She was told, courteously and firmly, by Mrs. Thorne herself, that His Grace had given his orders, and that Mrs. Thorne would take it as a personal favor if Miss Ashcombe did not fight him on this particular point. She did not fight him. She saw him at dinner. She sat at the long polished table with the candles going down between them, and she wore a plain gray silk that had been sent up to her room from somewhere. She suspected it had been the late Duchess's. Altered. And she ate slowly, and she spoke when spoken to. And once, when he asked her a question about a book she was reading, she found herself talking for nearly 10 minutes about it, and he listened, and he did not interrupt. And when she stopped, embarrassed, he said only, "Go on." They walked in the gardens in the afternoons. He showed her the roses. He showed her the small lake at the bottom of the east lawn. He showed her, one afternoon, a low stone bench under a lime tree where his mother had used to sit, and he told her, in a voice so quiet she almost did not hear it, that his mother had died when he was 7, and that his father had been a hard man, and that he had not, until the last year, understood how much it had cost him to be raised by a hard man. She told him, in exchange, about her own father, about the debts, about Marin, about the 10-year-old girl at the door of the hay barn watching a stableman catch an adder. "You have a good memory, Miss Ashcombe. I have too good a memory. It is not always a comfort." "No," he said. "I know." 12 days after her return, the trial of Roderick Renford was held in the county town, and Alistair went to it, and he came back 3 days later with a face that was harder than it had been. Roderick had been convicted. He would be transported for life. His mother, Alistair's aunt, had wept in the court, and had said things it did not do to repeat. Alistair had listened to them without answering. He had come home to Ravenholm, and he had gone to the nursery, and he had stood at the cradle for a long time, and Mrs. Poole, who had told Vivienne about it later, said that His Grace had put out one finger, at last, and had touched the baby's hand, and the baby had closed his small pale fingers around his father's finger and had held on. And His Grace had stood like that for near a quarter of an hour without moving, and Mrs. Poole had turned her face to the window because she could not, at that moment, bear to be a witness. That night at dinner, Alistair said, "Miss Ashcombe, Your Grace, you have been in this house since April. Yes, you have been my guest for a fortnight. Yes. I said when you came back from Bath that I would ask you a thing when you were ready to be asked. Are you ready?" She set down her wine glass. Her hand was steady. She was surprised to find her hand was steady. "I do not know, Your Grace, whether one can ever be ready for a thing one cannot guess. You can guess. Perhaps I can. Then guess." She looked at him across the candles. The candles were burning down. The wax smelled of honey. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 9. "Your Grace," she said, "I am the daughter of a man who died owing money in 3 counties. I have no fortune. I have no name that means anything. I have not been to London. I do not know how to dance the newer dances. I have a sister who has been beaten by her husband and who lives above a shop in Bath. I am 31 years old. If you ask me the thing I think you mean to ask me, you will be laughed at by every hostess between here and Northumberland. I do not care what hostesses do." "Your Grace, Miss Ashcombe, guess again." She swallowed. "You mean to ask me to marry you?" "Yes, why?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his own hand where it lay on the table beside his wine glass. He said, "Because I have watched you for 4 months, and I know you. Because you caught a viper with your bare hands to keep it from my son, and you did not tell me. Mrs. Poole told me. Because you paid a cook out of your own wages for a plate a small boy had broken, and you did not tell me. Because your sister called for you, and you would have refused, out of duty to me, and I had to tell you to go. Because you sat in this room a fortnight ago and heard that my own cousin had tried to have my son killed, and the first thing out of your mouth was pity for me. Because I have not, since my wife died, wanted to speak to any woman at any dinner table, and I have wanted to speak to you at every dinner since April. Because I do not know how I am to raise my son without you in this house. And because, Miss Ashcombe, if I did not ask you now, I would ask you next week, and if I did not ask you next week, I would ask you the week after, and I am tired of pretending I am the sort of man who can wait forever." She could not answer for a long moment. When she did, her voice was low. "Your Grace." "Alistair, yes, you do understand that if I say yes, I will still be the daughter of a man who died in debt. Yes, and that my sister will still live above a shop in Bath. Your sister will live wherever she wishes to live. There are 3 houses on this estate that are unoccupied. She may have any of them. Alistair, yes, you have thought about this. I have thought of very little else, Miss Ashcombe, for some weeks." She looked at him. He looked back. The candles were low. The wax smelled of honey. Somewhere in the house the clock had done striking, and there was only the small sound of the fire, and of her own breath, and of his. "Yes," she said. He closed his eyes for the length of one breath. He opened them. He said, "Thank you." They were married in the small chapel at Ravenholm on the 15th day of September, in the 2nd week after the leaves began to turn. It was a very small wedding. Marin came from Bath, walking on her own feet now, with a little color in her cheeks. Dr. Fenwick came, because Vivienne had insisted, and he stood at the back of the chapel in a coat that was a size too large for him, and looked pleased with himself in a Scottish way. Mrs. Thorne cried, and pretended not to. Mrs. Poole cried, and did not pretend. The baby, who was 7 months old now and had begun to try to say words, sat on Mrs. Poole's lap in the front pew and looked around at everything with great interest. And when Vivienne walked past, he reached out one small pale hand toward her and made a sound that was not quite a word but was the closest thing to a word he had yet made. And Vivienne stopped, in her wedding dress, in the middle of the aisle. And she bent down, and she took his small hand in hers, and she pressed it once against her cheek, and she went on. Alistair, watching her from the altar, did not smile. But when she reached him and looked up at him, she saw that his eyes were the gold color, and she saw that he was, for the first time since she had known him, quite unable to hide what he was feeling, and she looked down at her hands to give him a moment. And when she looked up again, he was steady, and he was ready, and he took her hand. They said the words. She meant them. He meant them. There was, in the middle of the ceremony, a small silence when the rector had lost his place in the book. And in that silence, Alistair looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them looked away for what felt like a long time, and she understood, in that moment, that this was the promise the day was truly making. The rest was words. They walked out of the chapel together into a clear afternoon. There was a wind coming off the deer park. The lime trees on the avenue had begun to yellow at the tips. The air smelled of turned earth and wood smoke from a distant fire and of the faint sweetness of the last roses. Mrs. Poole came out behind them with the baby, and she put the baby into Vivienne's arms. And Vivienne held him for a long moment and looked down at him and said quietly, so that only Alistair heard, "Hello, my love." Alistair put his hand on her elbow very lightly, and he said, "Come home." They walked, the three of them, along the gravel drive toward the house. The house was full of light. Somebody, Mrs. Thorne perhaps, had ordered every lamp lit, and the tall windows of the south front were golden squares in the pale September afternoon, and the stone of Ravenholm, which had looked gray when Vivienne had come to it in April, looked warm now, as though it had been holding a fire inside itself all summer and had chosen this day to let a little of the fire out. At the door, Alistair stopped. He turned to her. The baby was asleep against her shoulder. She looked up at Alistair. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he lifted his hand, and he touched, with one fingertip, the very small red mark on the outside of her right wrist, which had not quite faded and which he had, she now understood, been noticing every day for 2 months without ever saying so. "With your bare hands," he said, quietly. "With my bare hands," she said. He bent his head. He pressed his mouth once, very lightly, against that small mark. Then he straightened, and he opened the door, and he stood aside, and she carried the child over the threshold of Ravenholm, and he came in after her, and the door closed behind them, and the great house, which had been for so long a place of grief and cold rooms and closed doors, was, from that afternoon, something else entirely. It was home, and it was theirs. And it had been won, not by fortune, nor by name, nor by any grand thing, but by one steady hand that had known, in a bright and terrible moment, exactly where to close its fingers.